Good morning, and thank you for joining us. The Chamber has put on a series of webinars during this COVID time, and this morning we are welcoming Secretary of State Matt Dunlop with us, and he's going to talk to us about the upcoming elections. Secretary of State Matt Dunlop lives in Old Town, and he's Maine's 49th Secretary of State. It is now serving his 4th consecutive and 7th overall term in office. He has previously served 3 terms in Maine's 47th Secretary of State and is the first person to serve non-consecutive terms as Secretary of State since 1880. For those that don't know who I am Megan Diver, and I do government relations for the Maine State Chamber, typically focusing on education and workforce development, and I actually previously worked at the Secretary of State's office. I'd like to thank our series sponsors, Bangor Savings, Central Maine Power, and the Department of Economic and Community Development. And a few housekeeping things. Everyone will be on mute, but we will try to open it up at the end for questions. And if you have questions, feel free to put them in the chat box as we go along as well. And so for everyone that knows, also, we will be recording this. All right. Secretary Dunlop, are you ready?
I'm ready when you are.
All set.
Okay, well, thank you everybody for joining, and thank you to Megan and Angie and the rest of the folks at the Chamber for inviting me to be a part of this today. We've done a few of these, and the goal is to try to get out good information about what's happening with the July 14th primary and talk a little bit about how we got here. And I know there's a lot of questions, and when Megan said that we're going to field questions at the end, I think what you should be prepared for is it's going to be a very long end, because I am going to try to minimize how much I talk and try to entertain questions as much as possible, because that's why you're here. You're here to get your questions answered. So let's talk about what's happened. As you all know, things changed very, very rapidly over the month of March. I was in Washington, D.C. for the winter meetings of the National Association of Secretaries of State back in late January, early February. And at that juncture, what was happening in China was making the top of every news hour. And we were watching it. It was a bit of fascination, like, wow, things are pretty bad when they lock down a city of 15 million people. And then we saw it start to blossom around Iran and Italy and Germany and France. And then we got our first case in the United States. And I don't think, even though we knew this was spreading, we weren't really calculating what was the impact going to be in the state of Maine and the rest of the country. When we did get our first cases, state government acted very swiftly. And within a few days, really, we had a declared civil emergency. We had a suspected case in our own offices. That's why the motor vehicle offices shut down so rapidly. Thankfully, that turned out to be a negative case. But around that time, Julie Flynn, who is our Deputy Secretary of State for Elections, she has a national reputation. She's probably forgotten more about elections than I could ever learn. She and I began talking about what the primary is going to look like. We'd seen the interest in this year's election cycle through the presidential primary on March 3rd, which turnout was about double what we had projected. So we were thinking, okay, now we're getting into the general primary for state and county races and the federal races for the U.S. Senate and the congressional primaries. What's that going to look like? We began talking about different mechanisms and different scenarios, including what's been discussed around all absentee balloting. And Julie called me one day and said, we're getting word that a lot of town offices are shut down. And I'm not sure how we're going to manage an absentee ballot election for the June 9th primary if half of our town offices are closed. Who's going to be issuing the ballots and who's going to be processing them? And that's when we began to talk with the governor about the possibility of changing the date. There's been a lot of talk about different mechanisms that we don't employ but are used around the country, such as all mail, which absentee balloting and all mail elections, it sounds like a distinction without a difference. It's a very big difference. It's an entirely different system with an entirely different statutory framework behind it. Likewise, online voter registration has been kicked around a lot in the newspapers and on online forums, like 39 states have online registration. Why can't we do this? Well, primarily because we lack four things. We lack legislative direction to do it. We lack a budget to build it. We lack the time to build it and get it tested in time for either the primary or the general election. And our own information services staff, because we're a big enough state agency that we have our own standalone IS shop, they're working on a rotation as well. So we don't have even the available personnel to develop it. So, you know, in the Bangor Daily News, we put out an editorial talking about the mechanisms that we have in our disposal and the ones we don't. And we make probably an overused comparison to the Apollo 13 disaster, where, you know, 3/4 of the way to the moon, the oxygen tanks on the command module exploded, and they had a real problem, and they could only work with what they had. And the engineers at NASA figured it out and got the astronauts home safely. So, you know, we kind of describe this as an Apollo 13 scenario. This is what we've got to work with, and is it enough? And I think it is. You know, we have, the legislature has been very thoughtful and has used a lot of foresight in the crafting of our election laws. We have tremendous accountability in our election laws and great transparency and access. So, and coupled with that, we have some of the best municipal clerks in the country who are incredibly devoted to this process and are close partners with us. We don't oversee them, we partner with them. And with those assets at our disposal, we believe that we can get through this election very seamlessly with just really what's turned out to be some very, very minor changes. The biggest change of which is the most visible, and that's the change of the date. We talked to the governor, and the governor decided to push it out 5 weeks to July 14th. That will be the primary election. That will give us time not only to certify the tabulation, we'll be using ranked choice voting for contested primaries. We have the most recognizable ones, obviously the Democratic primary for US Senate and the Republican primary for the 2nd Congressional District. If no one in either one of those races gets more than 50%, then we'll gather those materials and we'll tabulate a ranking as we've done in the last couple of years. We now pretty much know how to do that. And that'll give us time to finish that tabulation, entertain any recounts that might emerge, and get that certification to the governor well in plenty of time to lay out our ballots for the November election, which we'll also be preparing for. So some of the significant changes that we've made in addition to changing the date, by executive order, there's been a series of executive orders that the governor has issued around elections, which include removing any deadlines around absentee balloting. This is something that the legislature did back in the 125th legislature, where they put a deadline in place for requesting an absentee ballot as 5 p.m. on the Thursday before the election. And that deadline has now been waived by executive order. So people can go to a municipal office and get an absentee ballot the day of the election, day before the election, et cetera. One of the questions that we've been getting is about in-person absentee voting in towns that have somewhat fragmented or uncertain availability because of either the pandemic or their own structural hours. And we tell people you have to work with your own town clerk on that. We can't tell the clerks when to open and when not to be open. And, you know, there's plenty of smaller communities like, you know, East Flintlock, where the town clerk works out of her living room from noon to 2 on Tuesdays and Thursdays. And so we can't tell them to be open 8 hours a day to do in-person absentee balloting. Voters will have to work with their clerk for that availability. So we do know, we have not heard, again, because we don't have direct oversight, some of our communications, you know, with town clerks comes in bits and pieces. So we have not heard that there's any town that is not available at all to do absentee balloting. So all the absentee ballots are out now. They were printed and mailed to the towns last week. We had hoped that most of our towns would have their ballots on Friday. And this is an important moment that we're trying to describe to people that, you know, if you're intending to do this by mail, leave plenty of time. The Postal Service is under the same pressure as the rest of us, and they've consolidated their distribution center in southern Maine. So there's been a bit of a delay. So some communities didn't get their ballots until this week, even though they should have had them on Friday. But we now know that all the towns have their ballots. If they don't, they haven't told us they don't. And they're going through the process of sending out the already requested absentees, which is a lot. As of yesterday, I think we had 82,000 requested absentee ballots. That's better than twice where we were in the 2018 cycle. So I like to think it's because of our urgent PSAs around voting that people have made this change, but I think people have done this on their own as well. We've had some partners like the AARP, League of Women Voters, Maine Conservation Voters, and others also, along with us, urge people to use the absentee process, especially if you're in a vulnerable demographic or if you have an underlying health issue. You can vote safely from your home, but if you're going to mail it back, make sure you leave plenty of time, a week to 10 days, because we can't control what happens with the mail. And if it gets held up somewhere, it's got to be in the possession of the clerk by 8 p.m. on election night. There are a number of states that go by postmarks, and that's a question we get a lot. We do not go by postmarks. It has to be in the possession of the clerk. So that's one change. Another change, it seems rather minor. It's one that we had a lot of feisty discussion with the executive branch about, and that's the changing the deadline for mail-in registrations. Historically, it's been a 21-day deadline to mail your registration in, and that 3-week window allows the registrar and or clerk, if somebody's left something off their registration or there's incomplete information, gives them time to get it cured so that that voter's name will be on the incoming voter list for election day. By executive order, the governor has reduced that time to 7 days, which is a very, very narrow window, but still people can mail in their registrations up to 7 days prior to the election. Also, we have gotten an allocation from the federal government under the CARES Act, which is over $1 trillion, but 400 million of that was set aside for election work around COVID. Maine's allocation is about $3.25 million. There's a match requirement for that. We have 2 years to get the match. We have to spend the money by November, and we have to account for it by the end of the year. The match is about $658,000. Our congressional delegation on both sides of the aisle is working very, very hard to work with their other members of Congress and the United States Elections Assistance Commission to drop that match requirement so that we can just use the revenue unimpeded. A couple of things we're doing. We are standing ready to help towns with postage around the absentee ballot process. If somebody takes an absentee ballot return, for example, and they drop it in a mailbox with no postage on it, it still gets delivered to the town clerk, but the town is on the hook for the postage. And that basically doubles the expense the town faces around absentee balloting. And our municipalities are not any better off financially than the rest of us, so we're very keenly aware of that. Also, we are providing personal protective equipment for all poll workers. We've got an in-state contract for that. We're using about $121,000 of the CARES Act money. We believe that equipment will be dropped sometime about a week before the primary election. And that will include face shields, masks, plexiglass screens, that sort of thing, to help the poll workers protect themselves. We've had a lot of questions about whether or not we can require voters to wear masks in the polls. We don't believe we can. People have a constitutional right to vote, and we don't believe that we can turn them away because they're not wearing a mask. But we're going to be using all the same protocols that have served us pretty well so far. The social distancing protocol, washing hands, hand sanitizer, and that sort of thing. So with those differences, on top of it, finally, we've put out some guidance on the acquisition of and use of drop boxes for absentee ballots. This is something that mail-in states make great use of. So there actually are products out there. They're kind of expensive. And we've put out some guidance. If we haven't put it out, it's about to go out around the acquisition and deployment of drop boxes. They're pretty tough. I don't think they withstand a direct hit from a 105 millimeter shell, but they're short of that. They're pretty durable. And obviously they have to be secure. And for the purposes of, certainly in the mail states that use them, a ballot is considered to be in the possession of the clerk if you put it in a drop box. So that'll be a big help. I know the city of Lewiston is looking at acquiring some, and we think we can also use the CARES money for that. One of the things that Michigan has done, and people keep waving it in my face saying, why haven't you done this, is they have sent an absentee ballot application to every voter in the state. You know, this is something, one of the queries we had early on is, could we send an actual absentee ballot to every registered voter, which is a really, really bad idea because we're not an all-male state. Our law stipulates that the voter has to start the process, that upon request, the voter can get an absentee ballot. So I had a state representative, this is the apocryphal tale to explain why that's a bad idea. I had a state representative contact me February after the 2018 cycle, and they had used the voter file to do a constituent mailing. These are the services you can get from your state representative, perfectly legal to do that. But they're gravely concerned that about 700 letters came back as undeliverable. They said, I think there's something wrong with the voter file. So well, bring me the mail. So bring me this grocery bag full of return mail. And I took stacks of it and I went into the voter registration system and matched up the addresses on the envelopes with what we had on file. And it was a 100% match. So the problem in that particular community wasn't that the voter file was wrong, is that the population tends to move around a lot. It's in a city, a lot of apartments, people will live somewhere for 3 or 4 months and then they change residences, change jobs, they move on. They may be staying with somebody for a while. And really when people are moving, the last thing they think about is their voter registration. They don't think about that till election day. And as much as we urge them to take care of it early, you always see a line at the registration table in almost any community you go to. So we're still beating that drum, you know, get it taken care of, don't wait. And I'm sure that there are people who, you know, they may not remember that they have moved, believe it or not, since the last election. They may think they're in the same precinct, even if they live on one side of town, they don't realize that by moving to the other side of town, now they're in a different legislative district, a different precinct. And even if they weren't, they still need to update their address. So that's going to be an ongoing issue that we're going to face. So that's basically why giving everybody an absentee ballot is a bad idea. So you have a lot of absentee ballots that are live ballots winding up in a lot of dead letter boxes or in the possession of people who shouldn't have them, people who may have already gotten their own ballot. Now they have two. You know, it just breaks the chain of custody. And that's something that we really, really lean very heavily on, that we can describe with authority who handles a ballot from the time it leaves a printing press to when it gets into the hands of a town clerk and then gets sealed in a ballot box. That's part of what gives our election integrity. So the applications are a different matter. We still would probably need an executive order waiving that requirement. And then it would cost us about $500,000 to mail everybody an absentee ballot request. That is about the cost of the entire primary. So in our discussion with the governor, where we are projecting anywhere from 15 to 25% turnout on a regular cycle for a primary, I think it's going to be a bit elevated because of the good work we've done raising attention about the primary and so many more people participating by absentee. I think turnout will actually be a little bit higher. But nonetheless, in the November cycle, we could be looking at anywhere between 75 and 80% turnout of eligible voters. So it'd be a significant bigger bang for the buck if you want to emphasize absentee balloting in November, to send out those applications in that cycle, since you only have one pot of money, you can only spend it one time. So that's basically the gist of it. Now, I know there are a lot of questions, and I know we don't have a ton of time, So Rhonda is asking if they are allowed to fill out a new intent to process absentee ballots as long as it is by the new deadline. Yes, we're going to work very closely with our towns on early processing of absentee ballots. We think we should be pretty open and loose on that, because like I think Portland already has 10,000 absentee ballot requests. How does a town apply for PPE and postage assistance? From Anthony. They don't have to apply for the PPE. We're just going to send it. And in terms of postage assistance, they should just reach out to us, and we'll figure it out town by town. Janet asks if Maine is considering joining ERIC for voter registration. Well, we've talked about that a lot. ERIC is the Electronic Registration Information Center. That is managed by the Pew Center for the States. We haven't done that because it's actually kind of expensive. And this is one of the things I think really helps us with processing the registrations of people who move here from out of state. Very similar to what the old Kansas Crosscheck would do, although Kansas Crosscheck was very cumbersome to use. It was free. We stopped using it because there are a lot of questions about whether or not it had any real benefit. The ERIC is a good tool, but it would cost us about $27,000 a year to use. And we haven't quite gotten to that point where we have that kind of money. Another question about running out of ballots from Emily up in Bangor. We're not going to allow that to happen. So, you know, we had a few towns feel the scare back in March because turnout in some precincts was much higher than we projected. We initially printed runs of anywhere between 50 and 75% of registered voters for this cycle. And I think we're going to go back and print a few more because the requests are coming in fast and furious. And we do know that we can use our CARES money for that because it is related to the coronavirus. So if towns do run short, we can authorize them to photocopy ballots. We really don't like to do that only because photocopy ballots do not really run very well through tabulating machines, which means we have to create hand cast vote records, which is a real bear on ranked choice voting. Another clerk asks, will the removal of the closed period for requesting absentee ballots stay in place permanently? Will continue through the November election. It's not intended to be permanent. It's going to be, if we have to use it again for November, I believe that either the current executive orders will have to be extended under the state of emergency, or they'll have to have new ones, because this is in the law that there is a closed period. So in order to waive that, it'll either have to be repealed by the legislature or undone by executive order in the state of emergency. Oh yes, and here's a good tip. You have to fill out the PPPE form, the personal protective equipment form that we've sent out in order to get it, so we know how much to send you. You know, because no two towns have exactly the same number of poll workers. I know that the larger communities will have upwards of 50 or more in a polling station. The smaller towns, like my hometown of East Flintlock, well, might have the bare minimum of 3 to 5. So we need to know how much you need. And another question is, will the use of Dropboxes continue after COVID-19? I believe if we're going to make that kind of investment and that kind of equipment, we ought to continue to use it. So I believe that, yes, it will continue after the COVID-19. You're going to see some permanent changes. That's the questions. I've been able to keep up with questions. Can we give us some guidance on precautions that should be taken on election day to keep voters and poll workers safe? This is something, that's a great question. And this is something that we've been telling our own staff. We've had, you know, we're one of the largest departments of the Secretary of State in the country because I'm one of 3 secretaries of state that has oversight of our state's Bureau of Motor Vehicles. People are somewhat surprised. I had a fellow ask me about a license plate transfer. Could I call the Secretary of State in another state to make sure he could get a similar number of plate? And I said, well, they don't have oversight of motor vehicles. Only Michigan, Illinois, and Maine form those corners of the iron triangle of motor vehicle administration. So we have about 432 people, which is pretty big. And we've had a lot of nervous folks around COVID, and because we sent everybody home, we brought them back gradually. And what we've been telling folks is that you can't, you know, we cannot guarantee anything. We cannot say that we're going to have this absolute ironclad barrier between our staff, the public, and the coronavirus, but we can use best practices to minimize the risk. And that's what we're advising people as they go to the polls, as they work in the polls. Poll workers in particular represent a real challenge for town clerks, because poll workers tend to come from the demographics of the most vulnerable among us. You know, the people who tend to be retired, may have some health conditions. I know the city of Portland is grappling with this right now because they have 11 polling stations and they were short about 120 poll workers. So as we talk about volunteer recruitment, AARP, League of Women Voters, others have been canvassing on this. And actually, every day I've had inquiries about how do I volunteer? How do I become a poll worker? And we tell folks, call your town clerk Poll workers are not all created equal. Some of the work in polling stations is rather complex, especially when you get around voter registration issues. Sometimes there are some judgment calls that need to be made that require some experience. But, ward clerks, ballot clerks, they can perform an invaluable function by being there and helping out in the polls. And what we find is that when people do volunteer, they find it incredibly enriching and they keep doing it. That's why our poll workers tend to work for 50 years in the polls, because they love it. They feel fulfilled, like they're really giving something back to their democracy. The executive director of the National Association of State takes 2 vacation days every year to volunteer in her polling station in Arlington, Virginia, and we're very proud of her for doing it. Let's see, some new questions. Can I explain the Dropbox? Well, the Dropbox is made out of steel. It should be bolted down. We have some protocols for securing them and locating them. And depending on how many we're going to need, it's going to depend on the size of the community. And I don't think we're going to see a lot of it for this particular July primary because it's very short. I mean, we're within, let's see, about 3.5 weeks from the primary. So November, I suspect we'll see more deployment of these, and we'll be able to answer more questions about an individualized community's needs around Dropboxes if they chose to go that route. How do we go about getting one, and will the state pay? I think as long as we have some available CARES Act money, we'll certainly be able to pay at least a percentage of that cost. And in terms of how to go about them, you should reach out to us. I don't have the exact vendor in front of me right now, or vendors. So in terms, here's a question from one of our esteemed city clerks. With absentee balloting allowed to occur on election day, I'm assuming we'll have to hold off on processing absentee ballots made on election day until after the polls close and until we're able to check the incoming voter lists at the polls to ensure voters didn't vote at their polling place. That's a really good question. I think in those communities that we do see a lot of early processing, that's something that we'd probably want to talk to you about that and how to process. We would not discourage early processing, even with the removal of the blackout period for absentee balloting. I don't think you'd have a lot more come in. You may have a few. If people, the incoming voter lists, this is something that we get a lot of questions about the integrity of elections, about people possibly voting twice. And we do get a lot of concerns after the election expressed to us that somebody got an absentee ballot, it was sent to them, but then they also showed up at the polls and voted. And did they vote twice? Well, a lot of times what happens is somebody will request an absentee ballot. It shows up this week, for example, and then they lose it. They get stuck in a pile of seed catalogs, or they mark it and they think, what am I thinking? I always said I would never vote for Matt Dunlap on a dare. And so, they show up at the polls and they vote. The post-election cleanup tells us what we need to know. And that is that, Matt Dunlap was issued an absentee ballot, never turned it in. As long as you can account for it, the clerks have to reconcile these numbers after the election. The number of ballots that were issued, the number that we sent them, the number that they issued, the number that returned, and all it has to come out to the same number at the end. So if you are in one of those communities that processes absentee ballots early, and it happens that somebody requests an absentee ballot, they've turned it in, but they also show up at the polls, we're going to send a detective from the Attorney General's office to have a very serious conversation with them and find out what happened. But I don't think that should necessarily prevent us from processing our absentee ballots. Let's see, what else? So I guess I'm not clear about CARES Act reimbursements around Dropboxes. Yes, we believe we can use that money to help towns either pay for Dropboxes or defray the costs. We don't know how many towns are going to be seeking Dropboxes. We know how much money we have. We got about $3.2 million. We've spent some of it already around PPE. We'll probably spend some more. I'm not certain we're going to spend all of it, but we could, and this would be a good way to do it. So if towns are buying Dropboxes, we'll be able to reimburse at least a portion of that cost for as long as we have that money available to us. In addition to PPE, Will the CARES money be used to buy other supplies for polling sites, plexiglass, hand sanitizer, et cetera? Yes, we consider that all part of the same matrix of things. So one of the questions is, we are allowed to restrict people from coming into the town office without a mask because we can offer an alternative method for doing business. Why can't we do the same for an election? Because we can provide absentees on election day. We aren't restricting their right to vote, just an alternative. You know, we get this question in a different form, which is, does requiring postage constitute a poll tax? You know, no, it doesn't. You know, because you have the option to go to the polls and vote. You're choosing another method to vote that's going to cost some postage. And so it's not a poll tax to require postage on an absentee ballot. And likewise, on the other hand, inversely, people have a right to vote. So you can't keep them from the polling place because they refuse to wear a mask. And there are going to be people who refuse to wear a mask. Now, this has not been tested. You know, I had one very earnest and eager voter saying that they believe that the Supreme Court would rule in my favor if I were to keep people from the polling places. That's very easy, and to feed me feet first into the legal wood chipper that is the Supreme Judicial Court. But really, I don't think that that would stand that test. I think people would have the right to vote regardless. One question is, do we have a cleaning protocol? Well, you know, we would refer people to the Centers for Disease Control about cleaning. We are not cleaning experts. We're not public health officials. We're following those guidelines, and we would urge everybody else to do the same thing. We have a selectman advocating shortening voting hours on election day. That is not allowed, correct. That is, the polls must be open from 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. on July 14th. Is that correct? Well, it depends on the community. Smaller towns can open later. We have to approve those start times, but typically towns will open anytime, really, from about 7 a.m. Everybody has to close at 8. There are a few polling stations that will open at 10. They're often done by 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and you're talking about towns that may have fewer than a couple of dozen voters in them. So, but they can't just do it. They have to work with us, and they, you know, if you have a community of a couple of thousand voters, we're not going to allow them to close early or to open late because of this. If they're going to be open, they have to be open. Can we use our existing Dropbox for ballots? We'd have to know what that Dropbox looks like and whether or not it's truly secure. We're talking about ballots here, and you know, and voters are like any other part of our society. When I was on the legislature and chair of the Fish and Wildlife Committee, we wanted to know something about compliance with fishing law. And Maine has something like 5,000 bodies of water, 3,000 miles of streams and rivers and brooks. And on duty at any given moment are probably about 3 or 4 dozen game wardens. You are more likely to be struck by lightning than you are to see a game warden on a remote trout pond somewhere. So we did a little survey about how compliant the public is with the legal requirement to buy a fishing license. And the number may shock you. It's actually about 97.5%, because our neighbors believe in the law and they support the law and they are law abiding. So, you know, of the 38 titles of law, 95% of it was written for about 5% of the people. So, you know, I don't think we have to worry too much about people doing nefarious things, but I think we also have to be mindful of the perception that things are secure. So drop boxes, and we have a very colorful history in the conduct of our elections that has led to the formation of these very good election laws I talk about. When I was first elected Secretary of State, a law office in Tennessee was closing down. All the partners were retiring. They're cleaning out the basement. And way off in the back corner of the basement, they found a wooden state of Maine ballot box, padlocked, with ballots in it. This was very exciting. And so they sent it to us, and it was from a town in Washington County. It was a municipal election. We found the results of the election from the 1930s. So we went through the process of opening the ballot box, and we sorted and counted the ballots, and it didn't make any difference. Didn't change the outcome of the election. Somebody thought they were helping a candidate by grabbing a ballot box and running out the back door with it, but it really didn't make any difference. But nonetheless, I mean, these types of historical moments inform what we do with elections and why it is absolutely so important to make sure we keep track of every ballot. So Dropboxes, we want to know what it is. You know, the Tupperware thing with a slot in the top, probably not. You know, this is why we like things to be able to withstand, you know, tow trucks and things like that. Here's another, I missed the deadline for early absentee ballot processing. Can we still do it now? Give us a call and we'll talk with you know, our folks. Towns have been trying to grapple with the same backlogs that the rest of us have. Give you an idea what I'm dealing with in my other hat of motor vehicles. We have something like 372,000 expired registrations piling up behind the dam. Right now we're conducting something like 3,000 backed up written and road tests. You know, the first day that we were open, we fielded 4,000 phone calls. The beleaguered group in the OUI section processed $11,000 in penalty payments in one day. Rapid renewal, which, you know, is a great tool for your constituents, especially those of you who are in town offices. They can pay their excise tax online and pay us the registration fee, and they don't have to come to the office. They can do it from the luxury of their living room. In January, we processed something like 13,000 rapid renewal transactions. In May, we processed about 50,000. So everything is rarefied right now. And because I'm on the acting chair of the Information Resource of Maine Board, a year ago, we had something like 3 hits a month on the CDC website. That has now gone up something like 81,000%, along with the governor's office. And so the demand for online services is very much helping mitigate some of the traffic in our offices, but it's still, we have a lot to shovel through. If we create a mail slot in the building into a box, would this also be included in the CARES money? Again, we're going to have to talk with you about that, about how secure that is. It can't be a place where people have access to. Will I still be visiting polling locations this year? Well, maybe. We got to talk about that. It may be a little bit dialed back. You know, there are some communities that are very, very dangerous to go to, and in any circumstance, like, you know, take South Portland, that lawless town. You know, so, because I see Emily Scully there. But we do try to visit some communities, answer questions, and field some media interviews when we can. But this is a different year. And I haven't decided if I'm going to vote absentee or go to the Old Town polling station and just check it out. I may do the latter, but there's a lot yet to contemplate. So what else do we have here for questions? Make sure I haven't missed anything.
I think you got them all.
Look at
Great
that, huh?
job.
Look at that.
Well, I'm sorry Meg has fallen off and she's having trouble reconnecting, but I did notice that Dana has joined us. So I'm going to unmute Dana. We want to thank you, Secretary Dunlop, for providing us with this wonderful opportunity. Dana, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, just my words of appreciation. It's always reassuring to hear, Matt, because you are so knowledgeable and so open in terms of your help and assistance. We can't thank you enough. Between you and Julie Flynn, we know we're in great hands. And with municipal clerks, as you said, being so dogmatic about doing the right thing and doing it with you, once again, there couldn't be a better testament to things that are done right, are done well. And that is the case with our election laws and the Secretary of State and municipal clerks. Thank you so much. Well,
thank you, Dana. You know, what our town clerks deliver to our communities simply cannot be put in a job description. They go so far above and beyond every day helping people. We're very, very lucky to have their service. I feel that in the city of Old Town, you know, is just really, truly extraordinary. And we do have some really good people that I get to work with. This is not exactly how I planned on spending my last few months as Secretary of State. I'm termed out after this year. And I was supposed to be going around congratulating myself for my exemplary service. instead, here we are at the barricades trying to keep the water back. But we're doing it together, and the people that I've been privileged to work with for 14 years, Megan and I got to work together for a while. We were sorry to lose her to the chamber. Someday we'll steal her back. But it's been a true blessing in my life. Many of you don't know me at all, but I studied Roman history in college, and I was a C student. And then because of that, I became a commercial cook for 20 years. And I got into politics because I was trying to help somebody. And here I am now, 24 years later, looking at the end of that time, and I'm the luckiest guy in the world to be able to work with the people I've worked with and be able to be touched by the people that have touched me. So, and the chamber is a big part of that family. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Matt. And we congratulate you. And as far as Secretary of State goes, you get an A+.
Well, thank you. I'll
Take
take
care.
that to my next job interview, whatever that is. Probably cutting grass in the cemeteries in Old Town.
Oh,
Thanks,
Well,
Matt.
thanks again. Everybody who's participated, I want to let you know that we will be sending along the recording. So if you missed anything or you wanted to hear something again, you'll have that available to you, and you'll have it available to share to any staff or friends that you'd like to share with as well. So with that, thank you very much, Mr. Secretary, and I wish you all a good day.